Welcome to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Hey everybody, we are here today starting this pod. And I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
And we're going to start by talking about trauma. How to know how to call it out if you've been through trauma. What is trauma anyway? So what is trauma anyway?
It's actually a really good question, to be honest.
Thanks.
Because everyone gets confused around what is trauma. You know, clinical definition around trauma is basically it is something that happens that causes our bodies and our minds to think that we are either in great danger or our bodies are in great danger or we're going to die. That is the clinical definition. However, we can show symptoms of trauma that we might not think it was a trauma. And part of that's because it is around what we perceive as dangerous, what our minds perceive as dangerous, what our bodies may perceive as dangerous. So it's a little bit different than what we kind of think trauma might be.
In the early days of, for myself, being introduced in the academic context of what was called trauma and what wasn't, I remember it being pretty confusing to try to draw that line between was the event the trauma or was your body's response to trauma.
Right. And it really is more what your body's response is. That is more the trauma. So we can be traumatized by things that other people might not be traumatized. Because at each situation, our body is bringing the memory of everything that we've ever experienced to that moment. And so it's going to impact how we perceive things. Because it kind of comes down to what is truth for each of us, right? We talk about it in communication. If you and I both witnessed a accident outside with cars, we walked outside, we saw an accident, and you would actually see different things than I might see. You'd pick up on different things. You would remember it slightly different, even though we both watched the same accident. We've had that example so many times in education, and we see it on TV. We hear all of that, but we don't necessarily apply that to trauma. So it is, to answer your question, it's more around how our bodies and our minds perceive the event.
And that's not exactly the same thing as saying everything that can be called truth is this amorphous, neither here nor there thing. But it's like maybe we could say subjectively experienced. It's like the meaning that you made and integrated, which of course is going to be individual and contextual to your own life.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. We use the word truth, but it really is that subjective experience. Because we know that if we watch the car accident, there would be something objective that actually happened, that, there is that outside of us. However, how we experience that is going to be different. So if I had been in a major car accident, in the past, and I watched that, my heart rate might go up a lot more than someone who was standing next to me who had not experienced that. For instance, my breathing may go up. I may start armoring. I may start physically sort of re-experiencing the fright that I felt in that previous car accident.
You said armoring?
Yes, the body armoring. It really is our bodies tightening up, getting ready to run away or to, hide, or all of those things our body is preparing for fight or flight.
So what about the ways that it will differ from person to person as far as what is experienced as life-threatening?
Right. And that really does come down to what we are bringing into that. Each person is different and individual. They have different genetics. They are born different. They have different personalities. They have a different way of thinking. Each person is wonderfully unique, right? And so they bring all of that to that moment. And when that happens, they interpret through that lens of who they are. And that determines whether or not they see this as traumatic, whether or not it's perceived by their bodies and their minds as, oh my goodness, this is extremely dangerous, and I could possibly die here.
That gets kind of strange, I think, for a lot of people in the details of it, because there's a lot up here that says I shouldn't be reacting any kind of way because this isn't a big deal.
Right, right. And that's where we have done a disservice when we talk about little t's and big T's. When we talk about little traumas and big traumas, there are really no little traumas. Either you have trauma or you don't. Sometimes our symptoms are not as intense or as frequent or as disruptive as other times, but the symptoms are still there if you have had trauma. So trauma is trauma. Uh, and I think that when we say, why were you traumatized over that little thing over there? We might think that, was that really trauma? Nobody else was upset.
Or
If
at
you're
least nobody else showed that they were upset.
true, that's
All
probably
right.
true. Yeah, that's probably true. Yes. But it is a matter of recognizing that if you are experiencing the symptoms, you have experienced trauma, period. Doesn't matter what it was. It's not the event, it's how we perceive it. So it doesn't matter if the event is seemingly small, like, I don't know, maybe watching the car accident and not being in it, even if it was maybe a fender bender. But if you're bringing in that experience of a major car accident a few years ago, it might trigger that particular experience. And therefore, this seems much bigger. And so this trauma kind of compounds the previous trauma. And so we have been re traumatized at that moment.
Mm. And to even stick with that example, I mean, one potential interpretation of an experience like that is, oh, just like I suspected, and just like I've been gathering evidence for, life is random and nobody's going to protect me when I feel unsafe. And
Right.
at any point, this could all come crashing down.
Yes, exactly.
But
That's
not everybody
exactly
makes that meaning of that experience.
right. Right. But some people do. That's what they bring.
Yeah.
Right. And life can feel very random sometimes. And this is a pretty scary world that we live in.
Yeah,
So,
true enough.
yeah.
Would it be fair to say there's even been a generational divide to some extent in there's been some pushback about calling things out as being trauma
Mhm.
from a standpoint of not wanting to become a generation of softies who are coddled for everything that goes wrong?
Right.
What would you say to that?
I would agree with that to some degree. I think the pushback is coming because it feels a little scary to some of the older generation, of which I'm one, but it feels a little scary to all of a sudden go, okay, I've been experiencing trauma. What do I do with that?
Mm,
Right. And we were told that these things weren't trauma. Pick yourself back up, get along. You fall down, you skin your knee, you're crying, and your parent says, you know, just pick it up and you're fine. You're okay. When obviously I'm not okay.
mm.
And if you put all of that series, after a while, we figure that even if we're experiencing these things, there's something wrong with us. There's something wrong with our character. But trauma responses are not a character response, right? And I think one of the things I'm liking about the younger generation, along with many things, but one of the things I like is
That's the one good
the
thing.
one good thing. No, there's a lot, but one of the big things I like is the emphasis on mental health and the emphasis on just actually being allowed to express your experience and to
Mm.
understand your experience in this life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really agree with that. I worked for a while. I worked exclusively with high school students, so I got to get a taste of that specific demographic.
Mhm.
And I hesitate to make blanket
Right.
statements, no matter what I'm talking about. The sense that I've gotten, at least, is it seems like kids are sick of being stuck,
Mhm.
and they're ready to talk about it if that means getting unstuck.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I
the
think
sense.
so. There's no shame around it, which I think with my generation, there was a lot of shame. We used to hide that we went to therapy. The younger generation, like, yeah, I go to therapy. Here's the name of my therapist, right? So it's like, yeah, I see this person like 6 times a week or whatever it is, but they're almost, and a lot of them will go to therapy just because they want to grow. And I think that that's actually a good move,
Yeah.
but I think it does kind of make the older generation a little afraid because how we got through things at times was basically just plowing through. And I think what they're missing is that as we move more and more as a society into accepting that trauma happens and that we have symptoms and responses, and we need to work with them and heal from them and build that resiliency. As we learn to do that, no one is saying that life stops or that we aren't supposed to participate in life or all of those things.
Mm.
But I think that my generation and older, as we were brought up, it was no, if you had mental health issues, you were incapacitated and you just can't participate in life, which is
Mm.
not what's true.
Wow. And that actually touches on something that's become important to me in all of this. It's, oh, this is not a simple thing to try to put into words. I'm going to try though. I think there's been a big divide, and I'm not talking about a generational divide. I think there's been a big divide between the head and the heart. And with that comes this belief that if we lean into the emotional side of things, it's going to drown us.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
and because that isn't something a lot of us were trained to manage, it it becomes a belief that it is inherently unmanageable.
Yeah, that inability or that lack of knowledge is really what it is about regulating our emotions, about how to step back from our emotions and be that mindful observer and allowing them, sitting in them, but allowing them to pass and remembering that we aren't the emotions. They can feel very intense and very scary. And I agree that there is this dichotomy in our culture. There's so many dichotomies, but this particular one is between the intellect and the emotions. And people are afraid that they're going to drown in them and that they're going to, there's so many times I sit with clients and it's like we need to look at that. And they're like, I'm afraid to look at that. I
Mm.
won't ever come back. I will just dissolve into this big ball of nothing, right? Which we know is not true, but it feels that way. Feelings aren't facts, that's true, but they are actually signposts. They are communication from our bodies and our brains to us. That's what they are.
And they're the motion,
Yeah,
energy and motion,
yeah,
emotion, the motion of life.
that's what they
If
are.
you're probably not going much of anywhere if you're not letting yourself get in that vehicle and drive.
Mhm. I agree. I agree. And I think that we tend to try to live our lives in our brains and we miss, like you said, actually life itself, right?
That's like that's its own existential terror
I
there if you
know.
actually come to terms with it.
Yes, yes. And it's not that I'm saying to the exclusion of intellectual pursuits. If you know me, you know that I do a lot of that. But it's more of a holistic way of looking at life. And healing from trauma actually requires a holistic approach
Mm.
because trauma affects us in a holistic way, right? So if we perceive that car accident, we have our symptoms, they're not just going to be limited to our emotions. They do distort our thinking. They that those symptoms, those responses to trauma distort our thinking, they distort our feelings, they distort our perceptions, they distort our ability to function in life, they distort our body's functioning as well.
Mm.
Those are part of the symptoms, and so we have to have a holistic view of life altogether in order to move past trauma.
It's well said. And the one thing that I will add to that is actually going back to that sort of fear of coddling everyone for every bad thing that happens and having that result in people being weaker and less
Mhm.
able to handle things. One thing that I've taken to pointing out, and again, this is just a line that I like to draw with a lot of clients that I worked with, is to say, we have to start by acknowledging what happened.
Mhm.
We've got to validate that experience and get it out in the open, let you process what actually happened. Otherwise, it ferments and rots in your mind and in your heart. Uh, but once we do that, that's not the end of the process.
Right.
Then we focus on mobilizing you so that you can decide, where do we go from here, because that's the whole point of entering the process at all, is that there is somewhere to go from here. The point is, you have been stuck, and if you're coming to terms with having been stuck, you can begin to come to terms with, wow, what would freedom look like? maybe there's something more than what I've settled for.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And that leads to hope, right?
What a novelty.
Yes. 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 All about hope. So,
Yeah. What would be a missed opportunity if we didn't at least touch on before we wrapped up this first episode?
well, I think it is the missed opportunity might be to, if we don't actually emphasize that trauma is what you perceive. If you perceive that you have experienced trauma, then it's trauma.
Mm,
No one needs to validate that. It is. If your body and your brain are exhibiting symptoms of trauma, then it's trauma. It is. And there's no little t or big T. Trauma is trauma, And I think the other thing is we try to compare these traumas as a way to say, mine's not as much or mine is greater.
mm.
The truth
A lot
is,
of people have it a lot worse.
yes, oh my goodness, every trauma survivor I've ever spoken
Yeah.
with says that exact same thing. No matter, I'm sitting there going, oh my goodness. And they're like, no, people have had it worse. I'm like, really? Have
Right,
they?
right. I hear
Right?
that almost as often as I hear, well, I don't tell anybody because I don't want to be a burden on anybody.
Yes, exactly. So I think just I would really like to emphasize that we need to just recognize and actually sort of just own the fact that trauma happens and that if we feel traumatized, we are.
Mm.
So,
And that more than it probably feels like, it's
mm,
actually something you have in common with other people because we're all human and all of us experience these things, whether or not we feel safe to talk about it.
yep, I would agree. I would agree.
Maybe that's a good starting point.
I think so. I think so. I think in our next few episodes, we're going to talk about the symptoms, what it might look like if you've been traumatized, how it might play out in your life.
Mm,
I think that would be a good place to start is the symptoms and also how our bodies respond to trauma and that link between our bodies and our brains,
mm,
right? And
that
our
sounds great.
emotions. Yep.
Yeah.
So,
Very good. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on the socials. If you know somebody that would benefit from this, share it to them, and stay tuned for more.